problem is sheer size.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Senator Coates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 4 of your statement, you talk about inflation. You say, with regard to inflation, longer-term inflation expectations have indeed been quite well anchored. Expectations among investors have changed little on net since last fall, and we are lower than a year ago. Substantial resource slack in U.S. labor and product markets should continue to restrain inflationary pressures. That's good news. That's good news for all of us. Let me ask you a question about the reverse of that, and that's deflation. We've gotten some bad employment numbers, not only for May, but the revision for April. Bad news out of Asia. It appears that the Australian manufacturing is in recession. India has posted its slowest growth in 9 years. China, many say, is on the verge of manufacturing a downturn. A lot of people are saying that we're at stall speed here in the United States. The question is, what is the risk of spending too much time worrying about inflation and ending up in a potentially deflationary new recession, perhaps prompted by a shock from Europe if they can't pull it together? And what are your concerns about that? What is the Fed thinking about that? Is that something we should worry about? Is that something you're worrying about? What kind of guidance can you give us on that?
Well, when we set our definition of price stability as 2% inflation, we meant that to operate in both directions. We don't want inflation above that, but we also don't want inflation well below that. We obviously want to avoid deflation. And it was one of the principal motivations for the so-called QE2 we did in November of 2010 to avoid deflationary pressures, and then we were in fact successful and brought inflation back to target. Now, part of your question was about sort of general slowdown in the global economy, and there are some signs, certainly in Europe. China cut interest rates today. Some of the emerging markets have seen some slowdown. So there's certainly some signs of global slowdown, and we're trying to assess how important those are and what implications they have for the United States. I would say, though, at this juncture that, with respect to deflation specifically, that we think deflation is, at this point, probably a pretty low probability risk. And at the moment, inflation seems to be pretty stable, close to 2%. We haven't seen much indication of declining inflation, particularly when you look at the either the non-commodity prices or look at expectations. So that particular concern right now is not, I think, very much in our forefront of our concerns.
What would a shock to the system, war in the Middle East, euro coming apart, what would that do to that analysis of what you just gave?
Well, I think it depends on what the shock is and how it ramifies. A shock in the Middle East presumably would cause oil prices to go up a lot. That would tend to be inflationary, but it would also probably slow the economy further because it would be like a tax increase on consumers who would have to pay more for gas and therefore less for other things. The euro situation depends a lot on, in the situation which we hope will not occur, in which there is a big escalation of financial stress. It would depend a lot on exactly how that happened. If Greece, for example, were to leave the Eurozone, but the stresses were contained there, then the effects would likely be fairly moderate. If the financial stresses were to spread more broadly, then that would create a lot of volatility in our own financial markets, would put stress on our financial institutions, would probably reduce lending, and would at a minimum tend to slow the economy. But again, I don't think deflation is the main concern here. I think the main concern is promoting adequate growth to continue to bring down unemployment over time.
Given the kind of fragile state that we're looking at, fragile world that we're looking at from an economic standpoint, and particularly the situation in Europe as it's unfolding, Do you sleep well at night?
Do I see?
Do you sleep well at night?
I generally sleep pretty well, yes. But I have a lot to do during the day, and I need to be well rested.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Bernanke. And